I'm going to give it a minute. They're still filling in here, so. I don't know. I think. Well, good morning. I think we'll get started. We'll let the stragglers come in and pick up our conversation. I think it's fair to say, even though it's a little bit early this morning, that today's panel is perhaps one of the most interesting ones we'll have during this conference. And as the moderator of this panel, I promise you I will do my best to make it interesting. As you know, the title of this is a year into Donald Trump as President of the United States. And my first observation as a Washingtonian is one frequently hears in Washington, that it seems like Donald Trump has been president not for 1 year, but for 10 years. As for the quality of his foreign and economic policy, I'll just simply rely on what his Secretary of Defense, General Jim Mattis, said earlier this year. And that is, he said that, you know, you can always rely on the United States to do the right thing after it has exhausted every other alternative. And he told his audience, which was an audience in Southeast Asia, by the way, that he hoped that people would bear with us. And as I think of that as a motto for American policy, bear with us, I think it is maybe an accurate or realistic depiction of how to think about 1 year or so of Donald Trump's foreign policy. Donald Trump came to the presidency with some very hard and fast views, at least in one or two areas. One, certainly immigration. Taking a strong position against enhanced or increased immigration into the United States. And interestingly, linked to immigration, the other hard and fast position was trade. The strongly held view that no country should enjoy a trade surplus with the United States. There's probably been no country more affected by this emphasis on controlling immigration and taking a hardline position on trade than the country of Mexico, America's southern neighbor. And there's probably nobody better positioned today, this morning, with us to address these questions than my old friend Juan Gallardo. Juan is a prominent business figure in Mexico City. He's built a large business, a large agribusiness in Mexico. He serves on, though, several international boards. And for the purposes, really, of our conversation this morning, you need to understand that he can literally be described as one of the fathers of the North American Free Trade Act. So I'd like to begin with you, Juan, to describe how you see the future of the North American Free Trade Act and what, though, American policy towards NAFTA tells us more broadly about Trump's foreign and trade policies.
Thank you, Rick. Let me start by saying it's a great pleasure to be with you, Rick, and with such a distinguished panel. I think Thierry's timing on the subject of that you just brought up couldn't be better, because we're frankly in the midst of the throes of this process of renegotiation. And I would like to break my comments into just simply 3 or 4 issues. Number 1, NAFTA, where it is, where it stands, what it's doing. Number 2, the wall, and where it is and what's occurring and its implications. Number 3, what is occurring in between. And then finally, what to do. Okay, so those are the guidelines. Starting, obviously, the 2 initiatives, both the renegotiation of NAFTA in the way it was cast and the construction of the wall, have created 2 very distinct feelings, which I think are important to say, within Mexico. The first one is one of uncertainty. Yesterday, we were already discussing the questions of uncertainty and maybe protectionism and other in several of the different panels. But here, very clearly, not knowing what is going to happen and when and so on creates this level of uncertainty, which is, from a business standpoint, apart from others, obviously a big handicap, because you don't know whether you shouldn't invest, how you should be going, and so on, and that has a cost, number 1. And the second one is the way it was cast, both the trade and the wall, created a certain level of resentment, and I think it's important to say it. When you're labeled as the culprit of all the immigration problems and all of the drug problems, and on top of that, you have samples of the wall being shown and so on, it's not exactly the most conducive conversation to a good working relationship. So in that framework, let me tell you where we are on each one of these subjects. Number 1, in the case of NAFTA, I don't think I need to make an explanation of just how unbelievably successful it has been for all 3 countries. I mean, every single serious study shows it and demonstrates it. And to say that, you know, all trade of the US with the world, 40% of it is between Canada and Mexico. So it's been an enormous success. I won't go into more detail, but it goes beyond trade. It goes into rules of operation. And I think that that part of the trade agreement is less visible, but just as important. It sets a stage that brings comfort and support and credibility to a process. And I think that element of NAFTA is very important. Where are we right now? Well, I think we're facing a great opportunity and at the same time a great threat. Great opportunity, why? Because simply any document you reread after 25 years of operation has got to have many areas of improvement, given the enormous progress that has occurred throughout the world and within the area. So there are things that are very interesting, like enhancing the dispute settlement system, like bringing together all the new technologies in the e-commerce, like locking in transformations like energy, which occurred in Mexico and which is a total no-no in the first go-around, and which today can be locked in, and many other things that can be truly enhanced and made that much more efficient, that much more enforceable, and that therefore that much more credible. So there's literally today 700 very talented people working practically around the clock to achieve exactly what I just said. The 3 teams, Rick, the 3 teams from Canada, US, and Mexico are people who have known each other for well over 30 years, know their subjects, and know exactly what needs to be done. Okay? That's the good side of the opportunity. The difficult side of the opportunity, and very challenging, are a series of initiatives that have been put forth in the last round of negotiation, which really basically go directly against the sense of competitiveness of all 3 countries, not just of Mexico, but of the US and of Canada. For example, like trying to administer a deficit. I mean, clearly that's not doable, nor should it be the measure of success. Such as doing away with a dispute settlement that brings credibility, strength, enforceability, and so on. Such as trying to link the agricultural industries of all 3 countries, which, by the way, have been enormously successful, to cycles that are not necessarily the ones attached to weather, but when one is producing and when one isn't, and so on. And then finally one that is a sunset clause, which I think is now being tabled, hopefully, which is we have to redo this process every 5 years. Well, that automatically condemns any kind of permanence and credibility for a process. So that's the bad side. The teams are working. On the wall, the casting is what is so wrong. It's clear that both Mexico and the US have a distinct interest in having an efficient border. The US, the drug side, the immigration side, which is so sensitive, though it must be important to mention that there's more coming back than going over now for the last 3 or 4 years. It's more Central American than it is Mexican. But be that as it may, it's totally valid to say I want to control my borders and my immigration policy. I don't think there's any dispute on that. And the whole drug thing, I won't go down that lane because it's a co-responsibility and it's so much more complicated than just a sentence. But on the Mexican side, we're just as interested. There are thousands of armories selling weapons, state-of-the-art weapons, to the Mexican drug dealers right across the border. And those armories are being paid with almost $50 billion of drug money flowing into the leaders of the cartels in Mexico. The combination of weapons and money obviously make the battles so much more difficult because everything is so much more affordable for them than it is, in fact, even for our own police, to the extent that we've lost over 100,000 policemen in the last 3 or 4 years doing the battle. So I think that we're just as interested in that not flowing towards us and as they are in the other. And there's so many new ways to be able to control and monitor, and drones and so on, electronics and what have you. They could be so much more efficient if we both really set our minds to it. So both things are doable, both things are threats. What is happening right now? What is happening right now is very interesting. First of all, both countries, Canada and Mexico, but I'll speak for Mexico, we're developing very carefully our plan B. Should the United States decide to leave NAFTA, where do we stand and what do we do? And we're doing that in a very, very specific, grounded fashion. We're doing it by enhancing our trade agreements. By the end of this year, we'll have a state-of-the-art trade agreement with Europe. We're rekindling the Trans-Pacific Partnership without the US, which is very interesting. It sounded like dead in the water. It's not. And we've improved what is called the Pacific Alliance. Beyond that, we're finding sourcing for certain key products around the world, which are more than happy to come into our market and that hadn't been there. So we have a plan B. It's not the plan we wish for, but it's one we need to plan for. And so that's what we're doing on that side. I think also on the US side, and I'm sure you've seen this, the reaction from our colleagues in the private sector and in the different associations in the last week from these different things has been very strong. Their role in the lobbying very strong, so we'll see what happens there. And then finally, we've also been very clear in drawing the line on anything that affects our non-competitiveness. Both Canada and Mexico have done that. And I think there's very much of a great possibility that that will hold and that we will overcome the situation as we're seeing it right now. Canada, in turn, has just finished, as I'm sure you know, a truly state-of-the-art agreement with the European Union. I mean, it is by far the most modern trade agreement to date, and it includes all the different things that I just mentioned that we would like to have in ours and should have in ours. So there's the precedent, there's the capability, and then you have, I'm sorry? I still have a minute, I think. Is that right?
I think that's a countdown.
I'm sorry. I get carried away with my subject, so I'm sorry about that. It's just important to see that how the private sector is reacting. If you see the anti-dumping that was levied on Bombardier, and the immediate reaction of Bombardier making a joint venture with Airbus, means it's all about optionality. If you can't do it one way, you're going to do it another. And I think that is very eloquent, and that speaks a world for what can be done. What do we have to do towards the future? Very simply, continue to strive for making the best deal possible, and we will continue in good faith to do so. hold our line where we've talked about it, define very carefully our plan B so that we're as efficient as we possibly can. I personally think that we will achieve what we're saying, in other words, a state-of-the-art agreement. And finally, last but not least, let's see how it goes. So, inshallah.
Thank you, Juan. So, Juan, you did a masterful job giving us a tour d'horizon of the North American free trade environment. You took exactly 7 minutes too long in doing that, and I am going to ask my other speakers to be a little more disciplined so that the audience gets a real opportunity to participate here. Now, I'm going to move to our next speaker. Donald Trump, of course, is traveling to East Asia in his longest foreign visit of his presidency so far. And Japan will be a key stop on that visit. And there he, of course, will be spending time with the newly elected Shinzo Abe, where I think it's fair to say Trump faces a certain tension in his discussions in Tokyo. He has, on the one hand, to deal with the whole issue of trade, U.S.-Japanese trade, and his focus on trying to balance that with the new emphasis on developing a new security partnership with a Japanese prime minister that seems open and ready to expand Japan's security role in the Asian zone. So to help us understand this trade-off and the tensions in these discussions is Yukio Okamoto, who now runs his own consulting firm after serving as a special advisor to 2 Japanese prime ministers. Mr. Okamoto.
Thank you, Ambassador Burt, and thank you for reminding me that it's a countdown watch. I'll abide by instructions.
Thank you.
I have many comments to make about Mr. Donald Trump, but after all, he is the duly elected president by the American people, so we respect their collective decision. And as far as Mr. Trump's relationship with Japan is concerned, I would say he's a good president. The good president, in our definition, is someone who prioritizes on security affairs rather than economic affairs, who doesn't make abrasive economic demands. And so far, thanks to the help of 3 generals, especially Mr. Mattis, Mr. Trump is perceived as a good president for Japan. On the other hand, if I can be blunt, we are a little bit disappointed with the inaction of President Obama in Asian theater, which we believe has emboldened China's ambition to go outward, especially its expansionary maritime strategy towards South China Sea, East China Sea, and to the Pacific. We have been always protected and supported by the defense people in Washington more than any other group else. And so we still feel that we are in the good hands of the wisdom of those defense clan. As far as economic aspect is concerned, yes, Mr. Trump did walk out of TPP, but Japan, as you know, has started to coalesce around the remaining 11 members to form TPP-11, which, if everything goes smoothly, we will come to a near conclusion by the end of this year. At which point we hope the United States will reconsider its position. For one thing, for instance, American farmers will be at a very disadvantageous position if the United States does not come in. According to TPP, our final tariff, for instance, on beef will be 9%, which the Australians will enjoy, of course. Whereas if the United States doesn't come in, they will be taxed at 38%, the current rate. So if they don't come in quickly, Japanese market will be swept by Australian beef. Mr. Trump's or the United States' most serious concern is North Korea. It is the same thing for Japan. It is our highest national security agenda. The problem is that this young, reckless, erratic dictator almost coming to the point of acquiring ICBMs capable of reaching the continental United States with nuclear warheads. The pace of the preparation is very, very impressive. This year alone, young Kim Jong-un has shot 15 missiles, including the failed ones. And since he came to power, he shot 94 missiles, as compared to what his father and grandfather did during the 25 years term, 61 missiles shot. And the pace with which Mr. Kim Jong-un is experimenting has been speeding up. I think the international sanctions has at last come to take effect, slowly but steadily. And Mr. Kim Jong-un, before he is completely choked economically, has to have the weapons in his hand. That's my personal thinking. Of course, he aims to have these weapons in order to have the subsequent negotiations as a nuclear state with the United States at an advantageous conditions. But my conjecture is that he has further ambitions of unifying the peninsula, the abortive dream of his respectful grandfather, so that he will be able to say, hey, United States, don't you intervene this time. You know what will happen if you do this time. Mr. Abe and Mr. Trump are in very good terms. As a matter of fact, they are playing golf together tomorrow. And I think Mr. Abe's role is to stand by President Trump, because this nuclear problem with North Korea will be a long, long game. After North Korea has acquired a de facto nuclear state status, we will have to beef up our retaliatory capability at a massive scale as a means of deterring their temptation to use those weapons, and also to build a credible nuclear, a credible missile defense system. And I think we will have to spend a long time before they are coming to a normal state. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, another important stop-off for President Trump in East Asia this week, of course, will be South Korea. And we're very lucky this morning, really, to have a key South Korean business figure with us this morning, Mr. Rin Jin Roy, who is the chairman and CEO of the Poongsan Group. In fact, he told me just a few minutes ago before we started that he is speaking today. He was meant to speak tomorrow, but he has to get back to South Korea to attend a dinner with Donald Trump when he is in Seoul. Again, in South Korea, I think President Trump faces this tension or dilemma between efforts to strengthen the economic and investment climate between the United States and South Korea, and protecting the KORUS, the trade agreement that was negotiated with South Korea in recent years, and the security dilemmas posed by the North Korean nuclear threat. So, Mr. Roy, we'll be looking forward to your thoughts on how we and how President Trump might resolve this dilemma.
Well, thank you very much, Ambassador. I believe I'm the only one person from this session who spoke last year in the similar session regarding America and the President and President Trump, who had just won the election. I hope I was invited back because I did such a great job in predicting what was going to happen with the new Trump presidency. But Ambassador, you just you told the truth. So no, actually, yes, you're right. I have to go back today. And it's very ironic that I will be speaking about President Trump, whom I have never met yet, but whom I will meet in the next few days after my presentations here today. As I was going through my notes from what I said last year, I was correct in most of my predictions, except for one, which I will explain to you later. First, I predicted that you will see an immediate shift from President Obama's liberal policies to a very conservative policies of President Trump. President Trump, in one of his first appointments, appointed a very conservative Supreme Court justice, as I predicted, and he will continue to appoint conservative justices, as some of the older ones will be retiring soon. I also said that his winning slogan, "Make America Great Again," will be good news for those who do business inside the U.S., but a big challenge for those who export to the U.S. from abroad. He has really turned the world upside down in that respect. For example, I have a big factory in the United States where we just celebrated our 25th anniversary. My late father, the founder of my company, built the factory and passed away a few years later after it was in full operations. Unfortunately, the factory didn't do very well over the years. So every time I visited my father's grave, I would report to him that your company is doing very well, but you made one big mistake in building the factory in America. Our factory is thriving this year. And when I visit his grave now, I tell him, "Dad, the factory is a big success. You were a genius. How did you know that someone like Donald Trump was going to be the president someday?" And there's more good news. President Trump is going to lower the corporate tax from 35% to 20%. Terry, this is even good news for you, because just from the tax cuts, my company will be able to continue to support your conference for the years to come. So you are the beneficiary of the Trump tax cut. I also said that President Trump will demand changes in the existing trade agreements, which is already happening now with NAFTA and trade agreement between Korea and the U.S. I predicted that Mr. Trump will ask allied countries like Korea, Japan, and NATO to pay more for the cost of the U.S. presence in their countries and in the region. You remember when he visited NATO, President Trump said, "I like your new building, but I won't ask you how much it costs." As soon as he said that, I think all the countries are spending about 2% on defense. So he got his demand there. Finally, I said that the biggest change will be in the area of immigration, especially for those coming from Muslim countries and Mexico. The good days of an entire family immigrating to America for better lives and opportunities are almost over, unless you're qualified with some skill sets and be able to speak English. I mentioned earlier that I was wrong in one prediction, which was I thought once President Trump took office, he will speak with more caution and in a more conciliatory tone with some demeanor. I was completely wrong in every aspect. And in fact, President Trump has gotten worse. He brags, he lies, he tweets, and can't seem to control himself. But despite all that, a lot of Americans still like him and support him. The polls show that his popularity is the lowest for a president in his first year. But don't believe those polls. How wrong was the poll when they predicted that Hillary Clinton was going to win by a landslide? Likewise, there's a lot of Americans who criticize President Trump because it's embarrassing to support him or to say otherwise. But deep down in their hearts, a lot of Americans quietly like and support him. So since I was correct in most of my predictions from last year, except one, let me give you some predictions for next year. President Trump's slogan, "Make America Great Again," really means make America strong and rich again. I think his tax cuts will be popular with both the corporate world And for those who are in the lower income bracket, the bracket will be lowered from 7 to 4. The US economy is thriving these days as stock markets are breaking records every few weeks. The unemployment rate is very low, getting lower, and around 250,000 new jobs was just recently created for the month of September. So economically, America is going to do very well next year at the expense of other countries. There will be a readjustment in the trade agreements like NAFTA and the US-Korea trade agreements that will benefit the US with changes in the tax law, with some of the changes in the negotiations. With changes in the tax laws and tax cuts, many American companies will bring their assets and cash back to the United States. From overseas, there will be a lot of foreign companies that will be building factories and buying assets in the US. I mentioned earlier about the late successes of my factory in the US, and we are at the moment already preparing to build another facility in the US. So the economic outlook is very good for the US next year. The challenge for President Trump next year will be the midterm elections. But with such good economic outlook, I think the Republican Party will be able to hold on to the majority or even increase the majority in both the Senate and the House. The biggest challenge for President Trump will be the outcome of the special prosecutor's inquiries on his Russian connections before the elections. But I don't think it is going to lead to his impeachment. There are so many layers to get to the top, and I don't think it will reach to him. On the diplomatic side, you may not like to hear this, but I think Mr. Trump is the right person in dealing with North Korea, as well as the terrorist organizations. America was very weak and passive in dealing with North Korea and the situation in Syria during the Obama years. I think President Trump will resolve the North Korea issue one way or another, hopefully in a peaceful way. But that will depend on Kim Jong-un. I think the terrorist organizations will continue to be weakened almost to a point of extinction, as he will spend all the heavy military resources and intelligences to go after them. So overall, despite the fact that he is uncontrollable, vulgar, and insulting, President Trump is going to survive. I just wish that he could be more honest, modest, and a compassionate person, but I don't think that would happen anytime soon. I ended up my presentation last year by singing a line from Nobel Prize winner Bob Dylan's song called "The Times They Are Changing." And boy, have the times changed. I won't end the song by singing this year, but I think there's a perfect song that somewhat depicts both President Trump's personal and political life. It's called "The Winner Takes It All" by ABBA. And yes, President Trump knows he's the winner, and he wants to take it all. Thank you.
Well, I have to say, Mr. Roy, if Donald Trump needs a first-class roving ambassador, you're the man. We're going to move now from East Asia to Eurasia, or what might be called Eurasia. Needless to say, Russia has loomed large in the new Trump presidency, but in a way I don't think ever Donald Trump anticipated. Rather than a kind of breakthrough in a relationship that we saw, say, between Nixon and Brezhnev in the late 1960s and early 70s, or Reagan and Gorbachev later in the 1980s, what Trump confronts is not a new era of cooperation with Vladimir Putin. Instead, he confronts in Washington a scandal which is almost reaching Watergate-type proportions. The question I have for our Russian participant this morning is, has Vladimir Putin written Donald Trump off, or does he still believe that it is possible for two leaders, Moscow and in Washington, to somehow salvage some form of cooperation, whether in, say, the Middle East, in Syria, or in Ukraine, in Europe, to help us address this this really critical question. We have Alexander Panov, who serves on the advisory board of the Security Council of the Russian Federation and heads the Department of Diplomacy at an important Russian think tank, MGIMO. Alexander.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, first of all, I would like to say that many in Russia, we see with humor and amusement what is going on in Washington these days. So many serious people in Washington are engaged in a very interesting and important activity, trying to find black Russian cat in a completely dark room where there is no cat at all. And we wish them all the success. And it seems that it's endless story. But more important, of course, to us to understand who is Mr. Trump. On my view, he is the leader of a yellow revolution, blondie revolution in the United States. At last, the United States also has its own color revolution. And why I think so, it's because he represents maybe not all, but middle class in the middle of, living in the middle of America, and who tired of American Washington establishment. That's why American establishment is against him so severely. But really, what happened, why he was elected? Because many people in the United States, they are tired to see two families in charge of America, Clintons and Bushs. And 2 days ago, there was information that 1 year before elections, Clinton and the leaders of the Democratic Party already decided that she will be the candidate, and all these primaries are useless. So Sanders, from the very beginning, didn't have any chances. So, maybe it's real American democracy, I don't know. So Trump, on my view, he has foresight and the skill of prediction. He sees weak points in American external position and internal development. He wants to revive American production capabilities to make America strong economically once again, and to think more about American interests, but not about interests of allies at American expense. So he thinks that multilateral agreements does not represent interest of America. So he started to move out of international organization. Look, it's and agreements. Look, UNESCO, Paris Agreement, TPP. Now there are rumors that America is thinking to leave WTO. And he is trying to change it with bilateral agreements much more in favor of the United States. And what is interesting that American establishment after the collapse of USSR was seized with happiness and euphoria because no strong rival enemy anymore, and the goal was to prevent revival of strong Russia. And political elite in the United States missed the appearance of China as a more serious challenge to the United States than Russia. China can lead the reorganization. We called it during Gorbachev era perestroika, the world economic order in its favor, pushing the United States aside. Xi Jinping already said in Davos this year that not globalization is the source of the problems, but the absence of adequate to these positive processes system of global governance. And they started, Chinese, to change situation in their views, according to their views. And the slogan of United States, the freedom and democracy, is challenged by Chinese slogan, justice and equality. So you may say that it is a new edition of ideological competition between capitalism, American style, and socialism, China type. Trump, as a businessman, and he showed during his campaign, he was afraid of Chinese economic might. And for him, Russia was not and is not a threat to the United States. Nuclear war is impossible. Economically, Russia is not so strong to challenge America. China knew about this, that China supported Clinton, actually. It's not about that I am warning about China. It's objective process. Trump intended to be tough with China, but now he forced by American bureaucracy to change this policy and to be tough with Russia. But the more he tough with Russia, more Russia is moving closer to China. Russia is not interested to have conflicts with the United States, no reason what for, and does not understand why United States so anti-Russian, even before elections was so. I think that because of internal problems, Trump is now and for coming period, of course he might be successful on economic front, but in general he is already lame duck, or I call it lame rabbit. He is jumping, but in chaotic directions, and because and now it's difficult to catch him, but he is unpredictable in his movements. But he has no full power, I should say, and he is unable to produce not only global but also regional strategy. It's the best example is North Korea. It's shouting diplomacy is not what we expect from a great leader of great country. Or what about the Middle East? Yesterday we discussed it also. Also, there is no leadership of the United States in this region. So I think that we all need strong America. We need just America. We need not selfish America, but we need America which can produce good ideas how to organize world order after Cold War. But we don't see such leadership. And very sorry to say that there is no communication between Putin and Trump. They met only once on sidelines of some conference, that's all. And dialogue, political dialogue on all levels are almost frozen. So if such witch hunting in the United States will continue, I can't see the possibilities to improve bilateral relations. I only hope that in the United States this history about Russia will not finish in the way what happened in 50s during Cold War when defense minister crying Russians are coming jumped from the window and killed himself. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Panov. I was interested in your invention of the lame rabbit line. I'll have to remember that. And I have to also tell you that unlike Mr. Roy, you will not get a job offer as a roving Trump ambassador. Now, finally, we're going to move to Europe, where I think it's fair to say there's a different view on the Trump presidency, and we're going to explore the Trump phenomenon with representatives of two countries that are moving in very different directions as far as Europe itself is concerned. First, I want to recognize Hubert Vedrine, who, when I was working in government, was known in Washington as a very smart and very creative problem solver, who then went on to serve as a distinguished French foreign minister. Of course, we've been watching in Europe and in France itself over the last few years the emergence of what might be called the populist threat. That threat, at least as far as France is concerned, with the election of President Macron, has apparently been contained. So my question to Minister Vedrine is, how does a Europe that is changing, evolving, deal with a populist America under Donald Trump?
Merci bien. D'abord, en ce qui concerne l'élection d'Emmanuel Macron, ils ont oublié que la langue, le français, était également une langue de travail ici. N'est-ce pas, Thierry? Richard.
Sorry.
Yeah.
No, this side of the room, for some reason, wasn't given any headphones, but... Oh, merci. Yes, a creative problem solver, Thierry. Thank you. Did you need one as well, I think? Our Japanese colleague needs one as well.
Il en manque un. Il n'y en a pas. Donnez-lui ça. Non?
There we go. I'm sorry, Mr. Minister.
It's okay.
Yeah.
Donc, première remarque. Dans les 2 années avant l'élection présidentielle en France, tous les sondages montraient que Mme Le Pen, donc le Front National, serait au second tour, et tous les sondages montraient qu'elle serait battue, quel que soit le candidat en face. Donc la bataille présidentielle française se jouait au premier tour, savoir qui était la personne qui serait là. Et heureusement pour la France, ça a été Emmanuel Macron, et nous n'avons pas eu le choix entre Mme Le Pen et M. Mélenchon. Et après, la personnalité d'Emmanuel Macron a créé un choc positif, mais ce n'est pas le sujet principal d'aujourd'hui. Je voudrais dire que l'élection de Trump n'a toujours pas été comprise par les démocrates aux États-Unis, par les forces de gauche et les forces progressistes en général, et beaucoup d'entre elles avaient adopté la ligne selon laquelle on ne pouvait plus convaincre les classes moyennes, qui sont réticentes par rapport à la mondialisation et par rapport à l'intégration européenne, et que donc il fallait jouer la carte des minorités. Et les démocrates notamment ont joué la carte de l'électorat féminin, plus toutes les minorités ethniques, sexuelles, etc. Cette stratégie a échoué, ça a créé une perturbation intellectuelle très profonde dont l'ensemble de ces courants ne sont pas sortis. Deuxième remarque, le monde par rapport à Trump est partagé entre quelques responsables qui sont très contents de M. Trump, à commencer par M. Netanyahou, mais ce n'est pas le seul. Par exemple, les Pasdaran en Iran espèrent que M. Trump va casser l'accord, puisque la stratégie d'Obama allait les asphyxier. Donc il y a quelques entités peu nombreuses qui s'en réjouissent. Après, il y a ceux qui en profitent indirectement. Et ce n'est pas qu'un paradoxe. La Chine en profite, c'est évident. va profiter des erreurs de Trump et va essayer de les capitaliser. Ensuite, il y a ceux qui redoutent directement la politique de Trump. Mexique, Canada, le président Rouhani, évidemment les Palestiniens et d'autres. Parmi ceux qui s'en réjouissent, je dois citer évidemment l'Arabie aussi. Après, il y a ceux qui sont déstabilisés et qui sont inquiets. C'est tous les pays protégés, plus ou moins par les États-Unis depuis l'après-guerre. C'est le cas du Japon, c'est le cas de la Corée du Sud, c'est le cas de l'Australie, c'est le cas des Européens par rapport à ça, avec une angoisse concernant l'article 5 de l'OTAN, dans le cas de l'Europe. Mais ça n'a pas provoqué de réaction organisée pour le moment. Mais donc il y a une sorte d'inquiétude directe. Et l'ensemble des autres, y compris la Russie, en fait, ils attendent, ils ne savent pas très bien, ils essaient de s'accommoder du phénomène avec des tactiques qui peuvent tout à fait varier. Au sein de l'Europe, il y a une différence d'attitude, mais qui est tactique, qui n'est pas stratégique, entre Emmanuel Macron, qui a essayé de nouer une sorte de relation personnelle, paradoxale avec le président Trump, pour amortir le choc, ou la tactique de Mme Merkel, qui est différente. Ça m'amène au scénario. Il y a le scénario de l'implosion. Le système est tellement ubuesque, enfin, absurde, que finalement tout éclate. On ne peut pas miser dessus. Il y a le scénario de l'impeachment. Il est peu probable parce qu'il faudrait que les électeurs, les élus républicains lâchent le président. Ils ne le lâcheront pas tant que l'électorat le soutiendra. Et il a un électorat qui est enchanté par sa politique de provocation et qui, pour le moment, n'attend pas de résultats particuliers. Donc l'impeachment, je ne peux pas dire que c'est impossible, mais ça me paraît improbable. Un autre scénario qui me paraît très improbable, c'est que le président se professionnalise. Tout ce qu'on sait sur lui, ça paraît invraisemblable. C'est d'ailleurs pas son objectif. Il a d'ailleurs été honnête sur un point dans sa campagne. Il a dit « je serai imprévisible ». Ça, c'est une promesse qui est tenue. Le scénario suivant, c'est la poursuite du système tel qu'il est, un peu confus, mais qui continue, parce qu'il n'y a pas de scénario de crise aiguë. Et je n'écarte même pas le scénario de la réélection. Parce que si, du côté démocrate, il n'arrive pas à surmonter la question profonde minorité-majorité, il se peut tout à fait qu'il n'ait pas un candidat capable de contrer. Donc c'est quand même des scénarios dont aucun n'est tout à fait encourageant pour l'ensemble des autres qui s'étaient habitués à voir les États-Unis comme point de repère, même quand il y avait des désaccords ou des controverses. C'est quand même déstabilisant. Que faire ? Que faire ? Je ne parle pas des pays adversaires, je parle des pays amis, alliés, partenaires, etc., etc. Que faire ? À mon avis, c'est Mme Merkel qui a dit la chose la plus forte. Richard Burt a été ambassadeur en Allemagne, il connaît très bien tout ça. Mme Merkel, après avoir rencontré le président Trump en juillet, elle a dit on ne peut plus vraiment compter sur eux, compter sur lui, et donc nous devons nous organiser mieux par nous-mêmes. Nous-mêmes, là, ça veut dire les Européens, mais les Japonais peuvent avoir le même type de raisonnement. Il y a un test en ce moment, dans pas longtemps, c'est l'accord sur l'Iran. Le monde entier a très bien réagi à propos de l'accord sur le climat, en disant « M. Trump peut faire toutes les sottises qu'il veut, nous, on continue. » Et nous, c'est le monde entier, y compris d'abord les entreprises. L'accord Iran, c'est plus compliqué. Est-ce que les autres co-signataires, Grande-Bretagne, Allemagne, France, Chine, Russie, peuvent appliquer l'accord, tant que les Iraniens le respectent, bien sûr, et l'appliquer financièrement, en se protégeant des représailles américaines? C'est un point clé pour toute la suite de la présidence Trump et des rapports avec le reste du monde. Voilà. Je termine sur un point. Je suis le plus synthétique possible, exprès. Dernier point, je ne crois pas que Trump soit simplement une parenthèse. Et je ne crois pas qu'après, on va retrouver un président rationnel, normal, et on va rétablir les relations entre les États-Unis et le reste du monde comme avant. Je ne crois pas. Il y a quelque chose qui avait commencé sous Obama, qui était une relative distanciation des États-Unis par rapport à leur rôle traditionnel et au reste du monde. c'est très compliqué de comparer parce qu'Obama était intelligent, séduisant, sophistiqué, etc., etc. Et Trump est brutal et vulgaire, mais il y a des éléments de continuité vers une sorte de leadership relatif par rapport à ça. Donc tous ceux qui ont, depuis plus d'un demi-siècle, ont travaillé étroitement avec les États-Unis, à mon avis, doivent penser la suite, et pas en termes nostalgiques, pas en termes de retour à une situation normale à la prochaine élection ou dans 2 élections.
I found that presentation particularly interesting in 2 respects. I agree very much with the minister and his discussion of the Iranian element, and I just have to say, as a kind of comment on that, the way President Trump has decided to deal with the Iranian nuclear agreement by essentially handing it off to the U.S. Congress and not destroying an agreement which he says is the worst agreement ever negotiated, tells me maybe it's NAFTA, maybe it's Iran, it depends on the day, but it tells me that with Donald Trump, his bark is worse than his bite. And number 2, what he said in his last remarks, what the minister said in his last remarks about the future of maybe American politics is very important, I think. I would not be surprised if the last real professional politician we've seen in current American history may in fact have been Barack Obama, and that both parties in our next presidential election will either get a charismatic businessman or businesswoman to run against a Hollywood actor. And if you want to watch who's beginning to emerge in American politics, keep your eye on those 2 categories of personalities. We may have seen the end of traditional politicians as we know it in terms of American life. Our last spokesman is somebody who knows the United States well, was the former head of Britain's legendary intelligence service, MI6, someone who had also a brilliant career in British diplomacy. And it is worth noting that if you want to understand, I think, the Trump phenomenon, you also need to understand, if you will, the Brexit phenomenon, because they may, in fact, be one and the same thing. So that leads me to ask John Sawyers my question of, how did it come to this? What is wrong with the Anglosphere? How did both the Americans and the British end up where we are today? I should add that he is chairman now of Macro Advisory Partners, a consultancy in London. John, you have the floor.
Rick, thank you very much. And I think I can confidently say that at the end of my remarks, I will be with Ambassador Panov not being a candidate to be a roving ambassador for President Trump. Because I think President Trump has got off rather lightly in this panel because his deep unsuitability to be US president, his lack of the qualities of essential leadership, of being able to empathize with those who are suffering, like victims of hurricanes and Las Vegas shootings, total inability to identify with people's feelings, and his complete lack of experience and decision-making capability on affairs of state has been badly exposed. So I think we need to bear in mind that we have, at this dangerous time, a candidate, well, not a candidate, a president of the United States who is quixotic, unreliable, and fundamentally unsuited to the job of being president of the free world. And that's a real danger. You ask what's wrong with the Anglosphere. I think America and Britain were the 2 countries that most embraced globalization and the competition and the boosts that globalization gave our economies, with positive macro effects, but we were slow to realize that the beneficiaries of that were relatively few, and those who did not benefit were very large. That fed into our political systems. And the second factor, I think, is that America and Britain have prided themselves on a two-party political system based on the first-past-the-post electoral process that we have. You have first-past-the-post, you have two parties. If you have a French system of dual election, you end up with 4 basic parties. But when you have two parties and there are new populist forces emerging, they will emerge through those parties. And so the populists took over the US Republican Party, almost took over the Democratic Party in the US, have effectively taken over the British Labour Party, and to David Cameron's eternal shame and damnation, he adopted the populist policies in the British Conservative Party and granted the referendum on the European Union. That's why I think the Anglosphere has gone astray, and the basic defensive mechanisms have not come into play. So anyway, we are where we are. Brexit is going to be a painful negotiation, which will probably end up with an agreement, but it won't be very satisfactory. Juan was talking about the EU-Canada agreement as being very advanced. Well, it's not as advanced as membership of the single market because it doesn't cover trade and services. But I think the UK will end up with something rather similar to the Canada agreement with the European Union. And there will be a period where our growth, instead of being greater than that of our G7 counterparts, will be lower than that of our G7 counterparts. It's possible it might come to a grinding halt if the present British government collapses, which is entirely possible. But it will take a change of government, I think, in order to change the course of this tragedy. Meanwhile, on the wider stage, we have, as I say, an unreliable and quixotic US president at a time when we have the strongest leader of China in modern history. And I think the Chinese see the Trump administration as a huge opportunity for them to accelerate the displacement of US power in the world. I think we will see the reaction of America's allies around the world, as Hubert has said, as being one of having to look more to our own resources and to our own capacities to defend ourselves, because that American security blanket is now conditional. It used to be unconditional. America's willingness to engage and resolve problems in the world, as we heard from the Qatari foreign minister yesterday, has just gone away. And so countries and regions are going to have to solve their own problems without America's help. And this is a great opportunity for China to step in, where China is now, in many ways, replacing America as the supporter and upholder of public goods, like action against climate change, like free trade. The United States has become a bit of a liability on some of these issues, which I'm deeply, I feel bad about. And I also feel bad that the United Kingdom, that quite often would step into America's place on these issues, is no longer able to do so because of our own political situation. I'm very glad that we have what are usually called grown-ups around President Trump to contain the damage that the president might do in the world. But I'm never very happy seconding diplomatic and political policy to generals. I have great admiration for generals on the battlefield, but less respect for them in terms of developing a diplomatic and political strategy. Because I think what we will find is that the generals around President Trump will see military solutions to problems which might otherwise be dealt with through political and diplomatic means. I think the chances of a conflict over North Korea are now considerably greater than before. And I know, Mr. Roy, you're a great supporter of many aspects of the Trump administration, but I think the impact on South Korea could be quite devastating if the generals around President Trump end up going down the path and taking the president down the path of a military confrontation with North Korea. So that is one thing that we have to be aware of. What we're seeing in the Middle East is an encouragement to local leaders. Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia is a classic example. Someone with a good vision for his country, but one without any experience or without the checks and balances within his own system to take wise decisions about how to achieve that vision. And we've seen in Yemen, we've seen in the conflict with Qatar, we've seen with the visionary but unrealistic goals that Mohammed bin Salman has set, that the ability of the United States to shape and channel a very important ally will be greater. It's not just in the political and security fields either. I think we will see America being pushed back as the dominant power in the global economic system. The first thing we're likely to see is attempts by China and Russia and other countries to be able to clear trade deals without going through the dollar system. I think we will see an alternative clearing system for international transactions which don't involve the United States and which will depend upon yuan as the driving currency. And I think that will be a fundamental weakening of America's control and authority over the global economic system. And as we're seeing in Saudi Arabia with the discussion about the IPO of Aramco, is looking a bit difficult for the Saudis to float this in London or New York. So we could well see this being replaced with a state sale to a Chinese entity. And the Chinese will seek in return, I believe, a stream of energy supply, oil supplies, priced in yuan rather than priced in dollars, in order to create an alternative pricing mechanism for global commodities, starting with the most important of all, namely oil. So we will see challenges led by the Chinese, but supported by others in the global system to push back American dominance in the world, and they are likely to be successful. And we will see action by America's allies to look to their own resources and their own capabilities with some unwelcome and dangerous results as America's leadership role in the world gradually is replaced by a nationalist America First agenda.
Well,
Thank you for that, and I would just observe that if we do see the emergence increasingly of a non-dollarized international economy, that'll also have the knock-on effect of undermining one of America's favorite foreign policy instruments, which is sanctions. So we've got a little over 20 minutes left in our program this morning. I want to open it up. There are a lot of people with their hands up, ready to be called on. Please introduce yourself, and we'll start right now with this fellow over here who did have two hands up. Now he's only got one, but there you are.
My name is Stan Kozon from Capgemini. I have a question for you, Mr. Okamoto, on North Korea. What could China and Japan do using trade and economic levers to get the country to choke, using your terms, before it gets full nuclear capabilities?
Before that, I want to say that I was very envious listening to Mr. John Soas. I wish I could be as scathing as he can, but then I have no agency to protect me, so I had to be moderate. But there is with a small reservation which relates to your question, that I have walked through many Americans through Gulf War, Iraq War when I was in the government, and it's my impression that military people are more cautious than civilians in using the force because they know what military forces can do. So, I mean, it all depends upon individuals. So, still I have a great faith in what the current generals are advising Mr. Trump, because in all honesty, if I have to take a guess, there is a 15% chance of the real war breaking out in the Korean Peninsula. Because what if Mr. Trump, hearing all the military options, say that, okay, I know that there are going to be many sacrifices, casualties on our part, but well, there's no other way. Let's do it. And what can the surrounding adults can do? They have to obey by the supreme commander, or unless they will be charged with mutiny. All they can do is simply to resign. So there is. It all depends upon what Mr. Trump himself thinks. So it is much better if we can choke North Korea through sanctions, which only China can do. North Korea has proved to survive all the pressures so far. The fatal blow to them will be the ban of oil export from China to North Korea. But how serious is China in really sanctioning North Korea has been my doubt all the way. It is a brotherly country for China, and for them to go nuclear, does it pose a real threat rather than to see another risk of China cooperating with the United States and pushing Kim Jong-un to the corner, almost to the verge of fall, inviting South Korean-led unification to take place with US forces on the peninsula. So China has been half-hearted in my judgment so far. But now, because of Mr. Trump's fierce rhetoric, China may have begun to suspect that there may be a real chance of a military crash between North Korea and the United States, which will entail China to a very critical situation. So they are now doing that. So we have, I don't know, maybe a year or a year and a half before Kim Jong-un, this crazy man, have nuclear arsenal to himself. But it all depends upon China, how they can pressurize him. And to a certain extent, Russia too. Thank you.
A year or a year and a half, right over here.
My name is Im Sung-jun, former Korean ambassador to Canada and Egypt. From the Korean perspective, Trump presidency, almost 10 months into the 4-year term, showed some positive signs as well as negative signs. In my view, positive sign is that Trump has put his heavy hands on the North Korean nuclear crisis. I think on this issue, we may come back in the later sessions on Asian security. Negative signs for Koreans were that Trump didn't like the 5-year-old Korea-US FTA. Well, that was unfortunately included in the moderator's term, the worst ever deal. And ordered his trade negotiators to make some change. How? I don't know. Maybe revise, maybe terminate, or to make a new one. Trump also withdrew from the TPP and almost terminated NAFTA. Trump's America First slogan did not stop there, but the US walked away from more important international agreements like the Paris Climate Change Accord, nuclear agreements on Iran, UNESCO membership, and etc. These actions by President Trump, many experts say, may lead to further weakening of the US global leadership and furthermore, disintegrating of the international liberal order, backbone of the post-war World War global governance system. Then what will happen in Asia? We have already experienced the strong rise of China. My question may be put to my old friend, Alexander Panov, ambassador. We worked together a long time. should we expect that the U.S.-led liberal international order will eventually be replaced by the new Chinese international order in Asia, if not in the world? In what form?
Well,
Thank you.
So I'm going to let Mr. Panov take a minute to answer it, but let's try to keep it short. There are a number of questions.
Very short. I don't know.
You don't know? God, I've had to come to Marrakesh to find an honest man. Yes, Elias.
Oda Aberdeen, the Capital Trust Group. My question is to you, Mr. Ambassador. When Ronald Reagan was elected in 1980, I heard his first speech. He talked about the evil empire. He seemed very hawkish. By the end of his term, he evolved and became a moderate and achieved a détente with the Russians. Do you think Donald Trump could follow that path?
You know, I would hope and love if he did. But I have to tell you, I think there's a fundamental difference between Ronald Reagan and Donald Trump. And the way I would describe that difference is, you know, many people don't know that Henry Kissinger had an older brother who also grew up in the United States. They're both born in Germany. And when Henry Kissinger's older brother was interviewed, he spoke with a perfect American accent. And someone once asked him, why do you have an American accent and Henry Kissinger still has a German accent? He said, because I was the one that listened. And the difference between, I'm afraid, Donald Trump and Ronald Reagan is that Ronald Reagan listened. Another question. Yes, right here. Yeah. You're next.
Thank you very much. I'm the leader of minority in the Polish Senate. Let me return for a while to the Euro-Atlantic zone and refer to what Mr. Soros said about this withdrawal of the United States from the position of the global leader. I would share your opinion totally, 1 year ago, when we were just after the presidential campaign in which Donald Trump undermined, in fact, many of fundamental pillars of American or Euro-Atlantic policy of America with the allies. But after he softened his position concerning, for example, the Article 5 of the Washington Treaty, after he decided, to strengthen his cooperation with Japan and to support South Korea in this danger of the attack from the northern part of peninsula, I would say, that your opinion concerning his way of thinking about the global affairs is not correct. And the position of generals surrounding President Trump, Jim Mattis especially, is one of those pillars that make anchors for the current presidency, presidential policy, in traditional way of American behavior. So do you think really that without the influence of McMaster, of Jim Mattis, the US would be able to really repeat its commitment to the Article 5 of the Washington Treaty? That it would be able to continue successfully the coalition of, or the leadership within the coalition of willing against ISIS, and finally to return to Afghanistan after 3 years of pushing Afghanistan aside. Thank you.
Well, don't get me wrong. I've got, is this working? I've
Yeah.
got huge admiration for those who are serving the President of the United States. I actually think they're serving their country despite their president. rather than they're serving their president. And I think on many issues, they are containing the damage that President Trump might otherwise do. So I'm a huge admirer of these people, and I think getting President Trump to recommit to Article 5 of the Washington Treaty, the core NATO defense guarantee, was an important step which was led by them. But it's clear, I think, in President Trump's body language and in his public language that he's not really personally committed to allies and to alliances, which is why I share the concern. Monsieur Vedrine may wish to add to his own comments on this. I share his concern as to, not to what Mrs. Merkel said, Chancellor Merkel said earlier this year, but the underlying reason was that Europeans do not feel that they can rely on the United States in the same way that they could before. So, and when I exercise some caution about the military advice around President Trump, and Mr. Okamoto picked me up on this as well, I do think generals, to their credit, like clear-cut answers. They like things to be solved. But in the North Korea case, I think the generals are coming to the conclusion that containment is not an acceptable policy, which for most Europeans would seem to be the only acceptable policy. And I think it is more likely now, and I put the chances at greater than 15%, I don't know how high it would be, but I think the chances are rising, of a conflict of that nature because of some of the attitudes that we see in and around President Trump. But Hubert, I don't know if you wish to add.
Minister Vedrine.
Non, pas sur la Corée, mais juste un témoignage sur les généraux. J'ai revu il y a quelques jours Madeleine Albright, nous sommes restés en relation amicale, et elle m'a dit en tant que démocrate américaine, je suis extrêmement perturbé parce que pour la première fois de ma vie, je souhaite que les généraux soient le plus forts possible.
Down here on the first row.
Good morning. My name is Aminata Touré, former Prime Minister of Senegal. I'd like to add a southern voice to the debate and maybe a feminist voice. So I would advise also to the organizer to get more female into the debate. We are talking about global governance, and I believe that women might add value to the discussion. Of course, the United States is an important country to everyone for different reasons. So from the South, and I think also from a diversity point of view, by the way, talking about minorities, I think that Hillary Clinton won the popular vote. So I think maybe her math in terms of numbers were right, but maybe her strategy were wrong, but that's not the question today. My question to all of you is, don't you have the feeling that there is a deep misunderstanding between the leader of what you call the global governance and the simple people, which lead to some weird way of voting? Maybe that was the expression in the United States. The right extreme wing in many countries getting stronger. And even from where I am in Africa, young people being despair when they do think that cynicism is more at the driving seat of international affairs. Because when we hear the global discourse with very disrespectful terms toward women, they are half of the population. That's what we heard from one of the leaders of this world. When racism is dealt in a very casual way, when some religions are also in the same disrespect, why don't we then think that there is a link between the lack of ethics and morality at the global level and what we are seeing now in terms of dysfunctions in the global world? From Africa, we do also have some deep issues with young people, for instance. And we do see how it translates into terrorism in some places. And when you talk to young people, they feel deeply disfranchised. There is no specific discourse to address their fear, their hope, and that is something we have to look at. Where I would like to end is, can we find a way to connect, really connect the global with capital development, et cetera, what we have discussed so far, and the local. And the local can be very specific in many places, like access to basic health, access to basic education, access to participation for women and young people. So that has to be factored within the discussion of the macro, so we can link both. And so far, what we are seeing is a disconnect that translates into violent action in many places. Thank you.
Thank you. I think that was a very important statement, and I hope we can continue to pick up elements of what you've said in our conversations today and throughout the conference. Over here.
Renaud Girard, I'm the Foreign Affairs columnist of Le Figaro. En 1965, le général de Gaulle, dans une conférence célèbre, a parlé du privilège exorbitant du dollar. Votre panel s'adresse au problème des rapports de l'Amérique et du monde. Vous n'avez pas parlé de l'hégémonisme américain en matière financière et juridique, c'est-à-dire la prétention américaine qui marche très bien en Europe de l'extraterritorialité du droit américain. Hubert Védrine a fait une petite allusion dans son allocution, mais c'est tout. J'aimerais avoir votre avis, et y compris évidemment l'avis de M. Panov, sur savoir si cette hégémonie, cette force du droit américain et ce privilège du dollar va se poursuivre, va se maintenir dans les 5 ans, 10 ans qui viennent, ou vous pensez qu'il va y avoir des brèches sur ce pouvoir hégémonique du dollar et du droit américain dans le monde?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm going to call on John in a second. I'm going to make a brief comment on this because something may have happened recently in the United States that you might have actually missed. The U.S. Congress in July passed a wide-ranging sanctions law that was originally focused on Iran, but then somebody at the last minute decided that, gee, we've got so many sanctions against Russia, let's add a few more, because we don't trust the Trump administration, so more sanctions were imposed. And built into that law were a number of secondary sanctions. That is extraterritorial application of those sanctions. So if anybody was doing business transactions through American banks or somehow any of those transactions were converted into dollars, the United States could then influence whether or not those transactions went forward. First thing that happened is Jean-Claude Juncker made a very strong statement in Brussels saying, if those sanctions are invoked, we will respond. Secondly, and I think more importantly, to give the Trump administration some credit, in August and September, there's some consultations were undertaken by the administration and the EU and European governments, and the guidance for those sanctions that were imposed have now been produced, and the secondary sanctions element has essentially gone away. So what I'm saying is that I think Washington is becoming sensitive to how our friends and trading partners are reacting and responding to what you might call kind of dollar imperialism. And I think there's a certain sort of rationality in terms of our sanctions policy in trying to impose them in a way that our friends and allies are not put in a secondary status or not given a voice in how those sanctions are implemented. But John?
I thought I had addressed some of the issues that you raised about the drive by China and other countries, including Russia and maybe India as well, to separate themselves from the dollarization of the global economy. And I think what we've seen is the United States has had that leadership role since 1945 and has exercised it by and large responsibly. There have been times, for example, in the 1990s when, under Clinton, when the US tried to exert extraterritorial sanctions on Europe and other countries relating to Iran and I can't remember where the other country was, but there were several countries involved, and there was some pushback against that. But the US has maintained its position by being guardian of the international financial stability. What we're now seeing is the United States, at one level, perhaps overusing its position in the global system, and secondly, because of the rebalancing of the global economy. I mean, it's only, in 1990, the G7 countries represented 70% of the global economy. They now represent about 43% of the global economy. The China is now, in purchasing power terms, is a bigger economy than the United States. And so countries are looking to free themselves from the exposure and vulnerability that being dependent upon the United States brings because of, exactly as you say, Rick, your exposure to sanctions. And I think this will be a major weakening of the Western system. And well, actually, although there's irritation in France and other European countries about some of the ways America exercises this power, by and large, it'll be a net loss for the West when we find ourselves competing in a world where the dollar does not have the dominant position it's had for the last 75 years.
Thank you very much. I'm now, before getting the evil eye from Thierry, I am now going to bring this session to an end. I want to do two things before I do. I first of all want to congratulate you, the audience. You've asked some very, very good and interesting questions, but perhaps more importantly, I want you to join me in thanking our excellent panel, which has been very fascinating. Good job.